parliamentlive.tv 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 parliamentlive.tv, 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 Parliament Live. Proceeding will start shortly. The 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 proceeding will start shortly.
Order, order. Welcome to the first evidence session of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee's pre-legislative scrutiny of the Government Draft Media Bill. We're joined today by the Commercial Public Service Broadcasters. We have Magnus Brooke, the Group Director of Strategy, Policy and Regulation from ITV, Khalid Hayat, the Director of Strategy from Channel 4, and Mitchell Simmons, the Vice President for Public Policy and Government Affairs at Paramount, which includes Channel 5. Before we begin, it might be very helpful for the panel and those watching our proceedings to be clear that today's session is not about the widely reported issues at This Morning and ITV and the broader implications for public service broadcasting. We will be hearing next week from Dame Carolyn McCall, ITV's CEO, specifically to discuss those matters, and we'll be raising them, of course, with other broadcasters in due course as well. Today we very much want to focus on the draft media bill and the significant implications that has for the industry. Before we begin questioning, can I just ask members if they have any interest to declare, please? Simon.
I'm a former employee of ITV.
John?
Yes, I'm a former news presenter at ITV.
Damien?
I used to work for ITN, so of course part of ITV, specifically on Channel 4 News, so I cover both of those, and I've accepted hospitality from Channel 4 in the past 2 years.
Gareth?
I have worked for ITV.
Anyone else? No. Okay. Thank you very much. So I'm going to kick off the questions, and I want to start by talking about the public service remit. We know that the current legislation has a requirement to provide specific coverage on various genres, including things like education and drama and comedy and children's and religion. But those specifications are removed by this new piece of legislation. What will be the consequences of removing these specific genres from the public service broadcasting remit, Magnus?
I'm not sure there necessarily will be very significant implications from that, partly because what that does is look at the system as a whole. It doesn't look at any individual broadcaster and say you have to provide each of those genres as part of your contribution to PSB. So in ITV's case, a core part of our contribution is news, whether that's nations, regional, national news, also current affairs, production outside London, independent production. So we make a very significant contribution to PSB in those areas, but no individual PSB, with the possible exception of the BBC, can cover every single area of the PSB waterfront. And I think what that looks at is the system taken as a whole. Is it providing appropriate coverage of all of those genres? So I don't think, in our case at least, it's going to make an enormous difference to how we deliver PSB, because I think we're very clear what our unique contribution is as part of an overall system. And of course the Secretary of State is proposing to take a power to impose new quota obligations, should that be necessary, should there be a concern from Ofcom in particular that there's a particular genre of programming where there's a shortfall of delivery.
Alan, what's Channel 4's thoughts on this?
Similar position. So we very much support the approach to more outcomes-based approach to regulation of PSB, and therefore support the approach to the PSB remit that's been defined in the draft media bill. At the same time, we as Channel 4 will also retain our own specific and distinctive PSB remit to challenge, to provide innovative content, and therefore we'll continue to fulfil that remit, and we measure ourselves on delivery of that remit through the Statement of Media Content Policy, which we publish and Ofcom reviews and holds us to account to. But at the same time, of course, there will continue to be obligations in the licence for Channel 4 and for other broadcasters on news, current affairs, regional productions, independent productions, which all fit with the key areas of content that the government has specified in the draft media bill, and again will make positive contributions to PSB in the round.
Mitchell, what kind of reassurances can you give us that taken together public service broadcasters will continue to be able to provide a diversity in the range of programmes in such things as arts and religion?
I think the key point to make, to build on the two previous answers, there's the PSB ecology is built around a certain level of complementarity between the different broadcasters. So we have increased obligations on children's content. We also have the Milkshake programme each morning. We have responsibilities on current affairs, regional programming, news, that is different from the obligations on other public service broadcasters. And the idea is that taken as a whole, the obligations on each of the broadcasters create some diversity and complementarity between the broadcasters. I think we all, we never called for a simplification of the remit. I think we're very happy with the simplification of the remit, and we don't foresee from ourselves as Channel 5 any change in the output that we'll put on our schedule as a result of these changes.
Do you think that there would be a decline in the way that these different aspects are covered in the linear services and a temptation to put everything onto the on-demand?
Well, I think that's going to be an important safeguard for Ofcom when it's looking at this issue. Clearly a key element of the draft media bill is about recognising that as audiences are moving away from live TV and linear TV viewing and are starting to view online, that PSBs will be able to meet some of their obligations through their online services. But equally, it's important that viewers who are still watching on linear, primarily on their linear channels, are also able to access that PSB content. So I think as we manage that move away from linear towards VOD, and it's going to happen over a period of time, we need to make sure that the bill is pretty good, we feel, in the round, ensures that Ofcom has the duties to ensure, just as Khaled has remarked, that if there is a gap, if there is an issue, in conjunction with the Secretary of State, they're able to make an intervention to correct things if they think they're not happy.
Khaled, we're concerned that those who aren't digitally enabled, those who don't have access to the internet for a whole range of reasons, won't be excluded from the range of different types of programming. What reassurances can you give us that there won't be any sort of decline in the public service provision on your main linear channel?
Yeah, so we're committed to our main linear channel, the core Channel 4 service, which is the designated public service broadcaster, but we deliver our remit across all our services, of course. But we're committed to the core linear service, and whilst at the same time transforming our business in order to drive digital growth, to anticipate and reshape what we're doing, in response to the market change and changing of viewing behaviour that Mitchell has described. But I think it's worth just being clear that we as Channel 4, and indeed all the broadcasters, have very much supported the extension of the licences for the digital terrestrial multiplexes. So we're all committed to and want a linear terrestrial digital broadcasting to continue well into the 2030s. So that's absolutely core to what we're doing. We're talking to Ofcom right now about the renewal of our broadcasting licence, which expires at the end of 2024. And again, that will continue to include obligations on the linear channel. But at the same time, given for Channel 4, given that we do have a skew younger than other public service broadcasters, we are, of course, anticipating what a younger audience is doing, where are they watching content, how can we deliver our remit across streaming platforms more effectively and drive growth in that area, and similarly expanding onto social platforms through Full Studio.
And Magnus, but what about for ITV? We know that you've had an enormous amount of investment in your online services and viewing on demand services in the last couple of years, and at the same time cuts to some other aspects such as children's TV. How will we protect the linear services at ITV?
I think I can reassure you on that, in the sense that what I think we're moving to is a hybrid world of linear and on demand, with streaming effectively a sort of hybrid of hybrids. In a way, it's a delivery of a linear broadcast service, but not linear service through IP. But for us, we've never really made niche content, niche PSB content. We've made content for which we want trying to find a mass audience. So we're trying to find that spot where we can get a big audience for PSB content. That's our rationale as a PSB. And the truth is that we're going to have to serve the linear audience and the on-demand audiences equally over time, because half the audience, or more than half the audience, is currently linear, and there's a significant audience in on-demand. If we're going to be able to pay for the content, we're going to have to use it both on linear and on demand for some time to come. At the moment, I think there are about 3.8 million households that are IP only, so they don't have a broadcast feed coming in. There are some estimates that suggest that might be up to 50% by 2030, and we anticipate that maybe 50-50 viewing in the UK television market as a whole. Around 50% of viewing will be on demand, 50% linear by about the mid-2030s. So for us to be able to afford to pay for the content, we're going to have to, as it were, advertise to an audience, if you like, on linear, because there's a very significant audience there, but there's a very significant growing audience in on-demand. So for us, the idea that we just put content in one place or the other doesn't make any commercial sense.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. If we could talk about the shift from proportion-based quotas to absolute ones to start with, if that's all right. How will that change the way you fulfil your public service remit? Mitchell, I'll come to you first, if that's all right.
Thank you. I mean, I think so the first point, just to pick up Magnus' earlier comment, Channel 5 still has quite a significant linear audience. Channel 5 is a destination for factual television, for leading on social issues, for the early broadcast of news at 5 p.m. So it tends to skew outside of the metropolitan centres, outside of London, and as a consequence, we have quite a strong linear viewing. In terms of remit delivery, we we therefore don't feel, we don't foresee a significant change. We feel that what we provide brings audiences to our schedule. It's absolutely critical that we do a full day of programming and people arrive, and we provide some complementarity to the rest of the to the market. But at the same time, My5 is growing, and we're also ensuring that audiences, as they gradually move there, we're providing for all of them. So we don't foresee any significant change to our output.
Based on that, Khalid, your audience is very different to Channel 4 because you're more metropolitan. Do you perceive a difference in approach there?
In terms of application of the quotas.
Yeah.
So on the topic in the area of absolute quotas, we absolutely support the principle that the government has set out that public service delivery should count across a range of platforms, right? And as we're all saying, we're about balancing output on linear and streaming services. And we also support the principle and welcome the principle that any new absolute quotas will be no more onerous than existing quotas. But as you'll have seen from our written evidence, we have expressed some concern about the concept of absolute quotas. And the reason for that is because of the reduction in flexibility that those absolute quotas would provide. So indeed we think the effects of those are twofold. So one being that by having absolute quotas, that reduces the incentive on broadcasters to over-deliver on quotas when times are good, because there's an absolute number that you're trying to hit, and partly reduces the incentive to over-deliver in order to save up, as it were, in order to because there's reduced flexibility to adjust commissioning activity when times are tougher. So we do have some concerns about the lack of flexibility that those absolute quotas would provide, and so it's an area that we have been discussing with Ofcom and DCMS in order to address.
You feel you've been heard in those discussions?
I think the government's position on that is they do want to implement the absolute quota. So I think we understand that Ofcom do share some of the concerns about the lack of flexibility. But what we don't have at this point is a ready-made solution to how to address those risks. But it's an area that we are alive to.
How much a risk is it to your business?
Well, all commercial businesses, we obviously are facing into the ad market. We make commissioning decisions in order to fulfil our remits, and in the light of the commercial circumstances that we're facing, and therefore reducing the flexibility that we have available to us does reduce some of the levers that we have to pull, and particularly in relation to, for example, regional production quotas, for instance. Where we're working with a supply base distributed across the country, absolute quotas create a degree of compliance risk in the event that if certain programs are pushed out later and so on and so forth, there becomes a compliance risk in relation to fulfilment of those quotas.
Understood. Magnus, same question to you.
Well, look, we have a slightly different position, I think, to Channel 4, which is I think we broadly support volume-based quotas with one small exception. And the reason for that, I think, is that for us, as we've talked about, there are 3.8 million households in the UK at the moment who don't have a broadcast service. So for them, ITVX is effectively ITV's PSB contribution, and that number is only going to increase over time, potentially as much as 50% or so in the next 10 years. So for us, it's important that we can deliver our quotas online as well as on linear. And we think volume quotas delivered online are quite important. And the reason for that is a simple one, which is the denominator of a percentage-based quota on an online service is really it's a floating denominator effectively, because we've got 15,000 hours on ITVX, for example, at the moment. That number fluctuates rapidly over time, over the course of a year. It's not like a 24/7 linear service where you have in effect a fixed number of hours, more or less, and therefore you can have a percentage quota relatively straightforwardly. On a service where you've got a very big fluctuation potential, or a significant fluctuation over time, and it's never constant. It's never exactly the same amount of hours. So you wouldn't actually know what the percentage number was until you got to the end of the year, effectively, if you're basing a percentage quota around ITVX, which is why we would support a volume-based quota. As Khalid said, no more and no less onerous than, let's say, the average of what the quota would have been over the last 5 years or so, which I think is the government's proposal. The area where I don't think we agree is in relation to the, or at least we have concerns, is in relation to the out of London spend quota, because there the government's proposal is to actually write a number down about this is the minimum amount of money you have to spend outside London. And to Khalid's point about fluctuations in the advertising market, if you take the COVID year, for example, would you be able to guarantee that you could meet an absolute number of spend? Because in the end, our budgets have to fluctuate over time to reflect fluctuations in the advertising market because we're commercially funded. We do have a concern that writing in a number without any caveat around, look, there has to be some reflection of economic circumstance, or if you're outside a certain set of tram lines, then there may be some flexibility around that number. That's our concern.
Focusing on ITVX for a second, I know that you perceive that there's a problem with keeping programmes online for 30 days. Could you explain and contextualise to us this morning why that's such a problem for you?
Yeah, no, very happy to. And the reason it matters is because it links into the prominence obligation, or the prominence benefit, if you like, from the PSB point of view, but also, as we may come on to talk about, the agreement objectives for the settlement of disputes between PSBs and platforms. So that's why it matters, because effectively content has to be up for 30 days on ITVX in order to count towards those two things. And look, from our point of view, we want to keep content up as long as possible because by definition that maximises the number of people who see it and therefore maximises the amount of money we can make from advertising. So that is our baseline position. We want as much content for as many people as possible, as long as possible. So that's where we start. There are, in truth, rights reasons in a handful of areas, particularly news and particularly daytime. And the specific issue there is we rely on the fair dealing exception in relation to the use of music and images and so on. And our own legal view is it's difficult for us to keep that content up longer than 7 days if we're relying on those exceptions to maintain those programmes. So it's specifically about news and daytime. As it happens, actually not that many people want to access news and daytime programmes after 7 days. In fact, a vanishingly small number of people do. And we also think that it's important that particularly news programmes have an ability to get prominence on platforms. So it's for that reason. There is also a sport. There is also, just in the case of some sports rights, we simply don't have the right to keep it up for as long as 30 days. We'd love to keep it up for as long as possible.
Understood. And Khalid and Mitchell, do either of you have the same issue or similar concerns as ITV in relation to keeping content on for 30 days online on your respective on-demand services? Mitchell?
I think we sort of sympathetic to the ITV position. I think the main issue for us has historically been around the sports rights issue, that sometimes you simply cannot get the rights. Obviously, we like to keep content on there as long as possible, but on certain instances it's simply not possible. So.
Understood. Khalid?
Yeah, and again, sympathise and understand the position, and from our perspective, we want the wide array, the full array of Channel 4 content that we carry on our linear and streaming services to be subject to PSB prominence.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rupert.
Yes, sports rights was just mentioned. I wanted to turn to listed events. So I suppose that's one where your usual binging, streaming on a box set versus linear real-time doesn't work. Well, people do watch it linear real-time. And in particular, these listed events where they go to traditionally broadcasters where 95% reach is there and is offered for free. There are worries that this draft bill doesn't protect that listed events regime enough. With things like the FA Cup, the Wimbledon, those kind of things. So I just wondered, do you foresee any problems in the fact that this bill doesn't include digital rights at all?
Shall I answer that? Yeah. Yes, we do. Listed events are very important for the delivery of PSB. They're one of the really best examples of the way in which PSB can bring the whole nation together. So young and old, people from all over the country come together. We had, I think, a peak audience of 27 million people watching the Euros in 2021.
The demand on the national grid when everyone's putting their kettle on at the same time.
Quite. But interestingly, within that, about 7.5% or so of our viewing for the 2021 or 2020 it was, wasn't it? Well, Euros was actually streamed. So it wasn't broadcast, it was actually streamed. That's quite a significant percentage. And look, we've got two concerns on the digital rights. The first is around streaming. So there is an exception that already exists where if you're not on a regulated EPG but you run a streaming service, and that's a lot of the streaming services at the moment, then you're not covered by the listed events rules. So in principle you could buy the rights to a listed event and then charge for people to access it. We don't think that loophole's been closed entirely by the media bill. In fact, it hasn't been closed by the media bill, nor will it be closed entirely by the extension of the regulation of EPGs, because quite a few of these streaming services are not on EPGs. So we think that in particular, because that's about live rights, it is a really, really important loophole that does need to be closed in the existing regime, and the government's gone a bit of a way, but not quite as far as it needs to go to close that. The second one, I think, is our other digital rights, and to give you an example of something like clip rights, where you can imagine a situation where someone could auction clip rights, which we currently get as part of our overall live rights for coverage, but you can imagine someone separating them off and saying, here's a separate package of clip rights, and you can show clips almost immediately after the coverage has been broadcast, and you can show every single clip if you want, and you could string that together and it would look a bit like on an online or a social media platform. It wouldn't look like live coverage, but it would be quite close. And the risk of that, it undermines the value from the PSBs and listed events, but secondly, I think it fragments the audience, because potentially what you get are categories of the audience, younger people potentially, choosing to watch on a social media service run by YouTube or by Facebook, rather than watching PSB. And we offer all of these things currently via our own services, and it would be a pity, I think, to split up that audience to allow those rights to go to other people. And gradually, I think the PSBs would find themselves in a bit of an old world of simply live streaming, rather than bringing the whole audience together with the whole event and being able to create a real national buzz around what we do, which is what we do at the moment.
You are on record, aren't you, as criticising this loophole that would allow unregulated... You don't think this sufficiently deals with it at all?
I don't. No,
okay,
I don't.
How would you amend the bill to?
Well, I think what you need to do is extend the definition of those people who are not PSBs, as it were, because at the moment there's a definition, I think, of it's a broadcasting service and internet program service. The definition of internet program service at the moment requires you to have an on-demand service associated with the streaming service, and I think that's the nub of the problem, because if it just said a streaming service rather than the definition of internet program service didn't require you also to have an on-demand service associated with it, I think that might do it, and that's the difficulty of the definition at the moment under their proposed amendment of section 98. We're happy to write to the committee with the detail of that, because it does get you into the drafting of how you would close that loophole. We thought the government had closed it, but actually looking at the definition of internet program service, if you were a streaming service without an on-demand service, you wouldn't fall into that category, and therefore you wouldn't be covered by the regime, and quite a lot of them wouldn't have an on-demand service associated with them.
Khalid, the Commercial Broadcasters and Online Demand Services Association say it's misguided to and it restricts competition to not have the digital rights within this regime. Do you agree?
Well, no, I echo everything and agree with everything Magnus has said, and I think, I guess in a way, just thinking about the context of the media bill as a whole, and I think consistent with everything that all of us are saying here, is that, look, what we think is that the legislative framework needs to keep up with viewer behaviour, and as Magnus has said, we see over 50% of viewing today is to live content. In about 10 years' time, that will be about a third of all viewing, and if the intent, or if the policy intent is that there are certain sporting events that are considered important enough that they should be seen they should be available to all audiences, universally available, free to watch, that's, we can absolutely support that principle. Given the way viewing behaviour is changing, it is only right that principle extends to digital platforms as well as linear platforms.
Okay, and same question, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, we wholeheartedly agree. It's Channel 5. I mean, Channel 5 has, as the smallest broadcaster, PSB rather, has not had any listed events for a while, though we have carried highlights for listed events. So where the main listed event has been on a commercial channel, we've taken highlights, particularly cricket, in recent years. But we absolutely agree that if the direction of travel towards making it a PSB benefit, and we'd also hope including digital rights is the right way forwards.
Do you think this bill as currently drafted would enable digital rights to be added?
I don't see any reason why it couldn't be added.
It sounds like the government's a bit dithering and deciding what to do. They've not quite made their mind up.
I think to be fair to the government, it's not a totally straightforward issue. I mean, I think the streaming issue is relatively easy to deal with because you're talking there about the live coverage, and that's what the list events regime does. I don't think that's difficult to make that change. I think the other digital rights is possibly slightly more tricky, and I think there what my suggestion would be that there is a secondary power for the Secretary of State to define other types of coverage or other types of rights subject to the same regime, and for that to be subject to approval of Parliament via secondary legislation would be my suggestion.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Rupert. John.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. I'm hoping to return to Channel 4 later on in today's questioning, but perhaps I could start with ITV and you, Mr. Brooke. Let's begin on the question of prominence. A lot of people are very concerned with prominence, and for people watching at home and they don't know what that means when you turn on your telly and you're looking at a list of channels, how high up are certain channels? If you do it at the moment, I checked this morning with Virgin, and astonishingly, right up at the top is, or near the top, is Top TV, which has got very small viewing figures and wouldn't be something I'd be particularly recommending anybody to watch, given the daily ranting that you hear there from presenters. What protection do you think there needs to be for companies like STV, for example, in Scotland, or ITV or others, in the bill over prominence?
Look, I think the bill is trying to, I think, do the right thing, which is to ensure that ITV and STV and others can get prominence for their on-demand services, which include streaming versions of our channels. And there's a very difficult balance, I think, that the government's trying to strike between making absolutely clear that these services are going to be prominent, and not just the services themselves, the apps, as it were, but also content within them, and the streaming services themselves if they're provided within the app.
So how do we end up in a position at the moment where Top TV is right up there at the top, and what could be done about that? Because that's promoting Top TV way above its position in the national discussion, its viewing figures, or any other criteria by which one would judge a broadcaster.
Yeah, look, I mean, Mr. Nicholson, you put your finger on a really important point, which is I suspect there is a commercial relationship somehow or other between that channel and the platform. And that is the nature of the problem that we're going to have to deal with increasingly.
What do you want in this bill to address that?
Well, I think what we've got in the bill is a clear obligation on platforms to make services like STV Player or ITVX prominent on platforms, and content within it to be prominent. What there isn't in the bill is enormous amounts of detail about exactly what prominence means. So it is different for a world which we have at the moment with the communications bill, where you have the concept of an EPG written into primary legislation. I think that's something that we're all quite keen to avoid, because there isn't such a fixed concept in the world that's hurtling towards us in terms of internet TV. What we need are a set of principles, I think, in the bill, and some detail around things like the fact that algorithms can't override prominence, which is a really important part of the the proposals that the government has made. And then what we're going to need is a really muscular interpretation and implementation by Ofcom, with very clear marching orders from Parliament. This is what Parliament wants to see in terms of the prominence of PSB content and players. You, Ofcom, must now go and implement that through a muscular set of guidelines which you draw up on the strength of the legislation that Parliament passes. I think that's the right way to do it, because I think the problem otherwise is you'll end up with a piece of legislation that's out of date before it's even gone through Parliament. Because the number of ways in which platforms make content prominent or not in this new world are so varied, from recommendations to voice search to other forms of search to the prominence of apps to all sorts of surfacing in various other contexts. So you're going to have a much more subtle and sophisticated approach, I think.
Okay, now as the Chair has explained, we're going to have the boss of ITV before us very soon to talk about the news story that's dominating at the moment, but I think it'd be very odd if we had somebody senior like yourself from ITV without asking a couple of questions about the story about this morning. I suppose I should ask, first of all, are you okay?
Am I okay?
Yes.
Yes, I'm fine, thank you.
Because I know that's the question du jour at this morning. I spent some time at the weekend talking to whistleblowers from ITV, including people who work and have worked in This Morning. It seems like a very unhappy place. Are you satisfied with the duty of care that the editorial team and senior managers provide to staff, especially young staff working there and at ITV more generally?
Mr. Nicholson, I mean, I think there's a very sophisticated and a significant system of safeguarding and duty of care at ITV with a very significant set of policies. We have a code of conduct which sets out our expectations about how people behave, and that deals with a number of different issues from equal opportunities to respect at work, dignity and understanding. And then we then have an important set of requirements which hold people to account internally.
Why are so many of the staff so unhappy, former and current staff?
I can't answer that question at the moment, Mr. Nicholson. As you know, we've also appointed Jane Mulcahy, a KC, to have a look at the circumstances.
Yes, I know. You already had an inquiry, and of course, and we'll come on to this on the 14th in more detail, but several of the claims that ITV made about that previous inquiry don't seem to quite hold water on closer inspection. What do you make about the bullying allegations that we've heard over the last week?
Do I make of them?
Yeah, what do you make of them? As a senior ITV official, what do you feel when you hear staff complain about bullying? Because that's the worst thing you can possibly hear, surely, as a senior manager.
No, look, we take our responsibilities in relation to safeguarding and duty of care very seriously. Bullying is absolutely in breach of our code of conduct. It's very clearly set out. We have a set of policies around bullying and harassment at work. And clearly, bullying is unacceptable. If we find bullying, it's inconsistent with our policy. We'd expect people to report it, and we'd expect it to be dealt with appropriately.
And of course, the person that reported in the first instance would be the editor of the programme. Now, we all saw yesterday that surreal performance by the editor of the programme, who, when he was being asked by a reporter from Sky about bullying on the programme, started talking about aubergines. It was surreal and bizarre. I think most people watching that would have thought, this is the person who's responsible for safeguarding young staff. He's being outrageously dismissive and flippant on camera about an immensely serious issue. I wouldn't like to have been a young staffer going and talking to that editor about bullying, given that that's the way he treats the subject matter on camera in public.
Let me reassure you, Mr. Nicholson, that we take these issues very seriously.
But what about what he said?
I wouldn't endorse what he said. In fact,
you agree it's bizarre.
I wouldn't use that word.
What word would you use?
I'd certainly say it was extremely ill-judged to say what he did. But look, I can reassure you on behalf of ITV that we do take all of these allegations very seriously, precisely because we do have a culture in which people's conduct it matters enormously to ITV.
Is his position secure after that?
That's not a question for me, and it's not a question for now. As you know, one of the ways in which we're demonstrating that we're taking this seriously is by appointing a very senior KC who's got very significant experience in dealing with HR issues and particularly sensitive investigations, because there are multiple things we have to take into account here around privacy and so on, as you will appreciate. And it's appropriate that actually the KC establishes the facts, gets to the bottom of what's happened, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John. Giles.
Thank you. Yes, I too have questions on that issue, but I shall leave them until Carolyn McCall comes before us in a week or so's time. But following on from John Nicholson's comments on prominence, it is said that for a public service broadcaster to benefit from prominence, and I'm going first to you, Magnus, if I may, it must be designated as an, in inverted commas, an internet program service, an IPS. It has to be readily discoverable. It's a bit of a wishy-washy term. What does that mean to you?
When you say readily discoverable, do you mean the PSB content within the service?
Yes.
Well, I think. Let me give you an example at the moment. So if you go onto ITVX at the moment and you're looking to find last night's news programme, all you need to do is scroll down the home page of our service in order to find the news content from ITV. So I think is it quick to find it? Is it easy to find it? Do you have to search 10 times and put in different words into the search function, or can you actually browse and find the content relatively easily? But in a sense, I can put your mind at rest from an ITV point of view, because I think about 70% or so of ITVX's content is originated UK content. It's not all first run, but it's originated UK content, which absolutely would meet the remit that we're set by Parliament as a public service broadcaster. So our entire purpose at ITVX is to make our PSB content as prominent as we can, because in truth that's why people come to ITV. They're not coming for content they can find elsewhere. They're coming for very distinctive British content, and therefore I can absolutely assure you that content is going to be the most prominent content on our service. And part of what we're providing is news. And actually the interesting thing on news on ITVX is we've had really quite good audiences for news on ITVX. If you take the first 4 months, we've had on average about 8 million views of streamed and on-demand news on ITVX since we launched. Quite a lot of that is streamed viewing, but some of it's on demand. But we've also had 6 million views or so in the first 4 months for our short-form content on ITVX. Because one of the things we're experimenting with is that are there other news forms that we can build an audience for via ITVX, which aren't necessarily about having to go the day after and watching on demand the news programme from the day before. Are there more imaginative ways we can repackage individual items and put them up and so on? And we're experimenting with that, which feels much more in keeping with how people consume news online, rather than watching an entire long-form programme a day after.
You seem to be very happy with the way that the bill is dealing with this whole promotional aspect, the readily discoverable aspect of it all. I mean, yes. But is it a level playing field? I go to Paramount on this. I go to Mitchell on this. Is it a level playing field for you, do you think?
Yeah, I think that we obviously have all of us on this table. Channel 5 in particular has its peak schedule is very much UK originated, and it fits in that factual genre. That's our kind of go-to. I think the two areas, if you want to go and binge watch Susan Calman's Grand Days Out, you're able to do that, and it's easily readily findable on the service. I think one thing that we are perhaps slightly differentiated from those on this table is obviously children's content. So if you want to go and catch up on Peppa Pig, or you want to catch up on Thomas Tank Engine, then clearly My5 is a space that parents and families are able to do that. So we think that the bill is broadly correct in this, in terms of making sure and holding us to account, as it were, that within our VOD services the PSB content is suitably findable and accessible, and clearly Ofcom will have powers to provide guidance to us to ensure that we are being held to account on this. So we think, broadly speaking, we're happy.
Okay, that's good to hear. Khalid, you're nodding.
Yeah, it's similar points, and I mean, for us at Channel 4, we deliver our remit through all of our services, and we consider we deliver our remit through our content as a whole. And within our Channel 4 streaming app, so it's recently rebranded from All 4. As Magnus describes, we think about the app in order to help, design of the app in order to think about how do viewers navigate through and find the content they need. But we also have what we call at the top the hero carousel, i.e. the titles that we're promoting at the top of the app, at the top of the home screen, which will include the most popular content, which provides a gateway into more challenging public service genres, but also we apply a public service overlay and the remit dimension to how we think about what we're recommending at the top of the app. So we absolutely think about surfacing the right PSB content and challenging content through the app, and then, as Magnus described, the wider regulatory regime has the media bill has the principles of ensuring that the app as a whole gets prominence, and the live PSB live streams get prominence, and the PSB content gets prominence in the user interfaces into which we're placing those apps. And again, whilst we think there are areas in which the regime could be strengthened, particularly in relation to the agreement objectives and Ofcom dispute resolution, the principles are sensible ones, which we want Ofcom to apply.
Can you say that again? The areas which could be strengthened.
So the area where we think there's strengthening required is is in relation to what are the agreement objectives, in the event that Ofcom needs to intervene. So what I mean by that is clearly this is about prominence for PSB apps and PSB services, PSB content, but it's also about securing fair value in relation to our relationships with platforms. And the regime will require that we as the PSBs or we as Channel 4 are negotiating with a platform in relation to prominence and access to our content and services. And in the event that we fail to reach an agreement with the platform, then Ofcom has a role to play as a backstop in order to intervene, in order to ensure that prominence is delivered.
In your view, that's a carry-out for Ofcom?
So Ofcom will have that role. The way the draft bill describes those objectives at present, it frames it in terms of Ofcom needing to take into account the costs associated with public service delivery. And we think that applying cost is too narrow, because actually we think the policy intention, and indeed Ofcom's recommendation, is that prominence should be provided on terms that are consistent with sustainable delivery of public service obligations. So what we think that needs to be considered in those agreement objectives is that it needs to take into account the value of PSB delivery and the value that the PSB content provides to these platforms, so that in the event that Ofcom does have to intervene, it can take that broader value into account, not just the costs associated with delivery.
Very good point. Thank you very much. I'd like to talk about video on demand services. And on this, I think, Magnus, I come to you. On what basis do you decide which content to give prominence to on video on demand?
How do we decide what to give prominence to? Well, look, it's a mixture of things. I think that fairly obviously, where we've got a new drama that we've invested a small fortune in, and we're very proud of, and it's got some top talent, we will want to make that prominent because we want to tell viewers about it, and we want them to watch it. So there are some fairly obvious things like that. I think there are other considerations around the audience. So are we do our numbers show that we're reaching all of the audience? Do we need to target particular segments of the audience more than perhaps we have been? So one of the things we're trying to do with ITVX is reach more what we call light viewers. So people who haven't necessarily come to ITV as much over the past few years, can we get them back into ITV? And so we'll look quite carefully at the sort of content that those viewers like, and then we'll try and make that prominent. But as I say, I mean, we've got a pretty prominent news rail on the service, and news is bringing quite a bit of traffic.
As you said earlier in the session, that of course you are a commercial operation. I mean, there must be commercial considerations to prominence.
Of course, and so the light audience point is absolutely about that, because it's about the reach of our services, and one of the things advertisers are interested in is yes, volume, but also reach. Are we reaching as much of the UK population as we can with our advertising? So that's absolutely part of what we're trying to.
Because the advertisers will go to where the prominence is, and will go to the.
Well, it would drive. I mean, the reason prominence matters is because it does drive a bigger audience.
Of course,
it creates more. It creates more eyeballs for advertisers. Effectively.
Absolutely. But the question I really want to put again, I'm using the term again, is there a level playing field across the ground here? I mean, because everybody is looking for the same pool of advertisers who want to come to their streaming service, their video on demand, whatever, and they want to make sure there's a level playing field. And the question I'm fundamentally asking is, does this bill do that? And I'll go to you, Mitchell, on that.
I don't think we have any challenges. To build on Magnus's point slightly, and not to be facetious at all, but if you take, for example, PSB players, the BVOD services, have a huge wealth of content, many thousands of hours, and obviously we want to support the PSB remit meeting content on top, but equally we're a commercially driven organisation, so it won't be uncommon, particularly on My5, that as you move towards Christmas, you will start to see a rail of Christmas movies, and it will bring people in. But the point being that commercial type content, or the Christmas movies, will bring people into a PSB service, and then when they're there, they'll be able to maybe move on to watch some of the content that was previously shown on Channel 5 as more kind of traditional PSB content. So what we're trying to do is both hit our objectives as a PSB to reflect people's lives back to themselves, but at the same time create a customer value proposition that is commercially orientated and helps us to then generate revenue that we can reinvest back into content.
Fantastic, very honest answer. Khalid, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, look, in terms of the level playing field point, I don't think the prominence regime is intending to or seeking to override consumer choice. I mean, ultimately, viewers will watch what they want to watch, but we as the UK have taken the view that public service content matters and public service broadcasting matters, and therefore we all think that public service content should be easy to find so that viewers can discover it and ultimately then make the choices and informed choices that they want to make.
Very clear. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Jane.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. I want to turn to selection services and smart TVs and how people are accessing content. The bill aims to capture selection services, but it doesn't cover mobile phones and tablets and other devices. The BBC said that a quarter of content hours on iPlayer in 22 were accessed on other devices that would fall outside the bill. So I'd like to ask, do you think that needs closing? Is it a loophole that you're concerned about, Magnus?
I mean, yes, to an extent. I think that what you can see in the market is that the accessing through tablets and computers is going down quite rapidly, and actually people are now increasingly watching on TV-like devices. I think there are devices, if you like, dual-use devices, particularly gaming consoles and so on, where I think there is more of a question about whether the bill ought to cover those. But I think we think that the bill currently will cover the majority of ITVX's viewing, and so I think we. Of course, we'd prefer it if it went further, but I think I don't think we're desperately uncomfortable with where the government's ended up. And I would make a more general point, which is, we're talking a lot here about the sort of defects, if you like, of the bill. I think there's just stepping back for a second. I mean, we think the bill is, broadly speaking, going absolutely in the right direction. I think the definition of selection service is quite flexible, and there is a possibility in future that could be broadened out if viewing behaviour changes. And one of the things we're keenest to make sure, actually, is that things that might be excluded at the beginning could potentially come back in if it turns out that we're wrong and that people do carry on, and indeed viewing through tablets increase, for example, or let's say YouTube. I mean, let's say, imagine YouTube start providing what looks like a television selection service because they start aggregating together lots of television, on-demand television services together. It would be entirely appropriate for YouTube at that point to be covered by the bill, and it seems to me there's nothing in the bill at the moment that would stop that from happening. It may not be the case and legitimate at the beginning, but the important thing is that we have a bill that's capable of extending to those platforms, which I think the bill is. I think the only thing it rules out is the button on the remote control, because I think the government's view is that took them into territory, international trade territory, which could cause difficulty. But that seems to me the hardware exception, as it were, in the bill is the main area which isn't going to change. But actually the rest of it is